The Cloak by Nikolai Vasilievich Gogol. Translation from the Russian by Isabel F. Hapgood. Read by Alan Davis Drake. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to learn how to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Cloak, Part 1 of 2. In the department of... But it is better not to name the department. There is nothing more irritable than all kinds of departments, regiments, courts of justice, and in a word, every branch of public service. Each separate man nowadays thinks all society insulted in his person. They say that quite recently a complaint was received from a justice of the peace, in which he plainly demonstrated that all the imperial institutions were going to the dogs, and that his sacred name was being taken in vain, and in proof he appended to the complaint a huge volume of some romantic composition, in which the justice of the peace appears about once in every 10 lines, sometimes in a drunken condition. Therefore, in order to avoid all unpleasantness, it would be better for us to designate the department in question as a certain department. So, in a certain department serves a certain chinovnik, official. Not a very prominent official, it must be allowed, short of stature, somewhat pockmarked, rather red-haired, rather blind, judging from appearances, with a small bald spot on his forehead, with wrinkles on his cheeks, with a complexion of the sort called sanguine. How could he help it? The Petersburg climate was responsible for that. As for his chin, rank, for which the rank must be stated first of all, he was what is called a perpetual titular councillor, over which, as is well known, some writers make merry and crack their jokes, as they have the praiseworthy custom of attacking those who cannot bite back. His family name was Bashmachkin. It is evident from the name that it originated in bashmak, shoe, but when, at what time, and in what manner is not known. His father and grandfather, and even his brother-in-law, and all the Bashmachkins, always wore boots, and only had new heels 2 or 3 times a year. His name was Akaky Akakeyevich. It may strike the reader as rather singular and far-fetched, but he may feel assured that it was by no means far-fetched, and that the circumstances were such that it would have been impossible to give him any other name. And this was how it came about. Akaky Akakeyevich was born, if my memory fails me not, towards the night of the 23rd of March. His late mother, the wife of a chinovnik, and a very fine woman, made all due arrangements for having the child baptized. His mother was lying on the bed opposite the door. On her right stood the godfather, a most estimable man, Ivan Ivanovich Eroshkin, who served as presiding officer of the Senate, and the godmother, the wife of an officer of the quarter, a woman of rare virtues, Anna Semenovna Bilobroshkova. They offered the mother her choice of 3 names, Mokia Sosia, or that the child should be called after the martyr Kozdazat. "No," pronounced the blessed mother, "all those names are poor." In order to please her, they opened the calendar at another place. 3 more names appeared, Trifili, Dula, and Varakasi.
"This is a judgment,"
said the old woman.
"What names! I never heard the like. Varadat or Varuk might have been born, but not Trifilili and Varakashi."
They turned another page, Pavsikaki and Vaktisi.
"Now I see,"
said the old woman,
"that it is plainly fate, and if that's the case, it will be better to name him after his father. His father's name was Akaky, so let his sons be also Akaky."
In this manner he became Akaky Akakeyevich. They christened the child, whereupon he wept and made a grimace, as though he foresaw that he was to be a titular councillor, In this manner did it all come about. We have mentioned it in order that the reader might see for himself that it happened quite as a case of necessity, and that it was utterly impossible to give him any other name. When and how he entered the department, and who appointed him, no one could remember. However much the directors and chiefs of all kinds were changed, he was always to be seen in the same place, the same attitude, the same occupation, the same official for letters, so that afterwards it was affirmed that he had been born in undress uniform with a bald spot on his head. No respect was shown him in the department. The janitor not only did not rise from his seat when he passed, but never even glanced at him, as if only a fly had flown through the reception-room. His superiors treated him with a coolly despotic manner. Some assistant chief would thrust a paper under his nose without so much as saying, "Copy," or "Here's a nice interesting matter," or anything else agreeable, as is customary in well-bred service. And he took it, looking only at the paper and not observing who handed it to him, or whether he had the right to do so. He simply took it and set about copying it. The young officials laughed at and made fun of him, so far as their official wit permitted, recounted there in his presence various stories concocted about him, and about his landlady, an old woman of 70. They said that she had beat him, asked when the wedding was to be, and strewed bits of paper over his head, calling them snow. But Akaky Akakiyevich answered not a word, as though there had been no one before him. It even had no effect upon his employment. Amid all these molestations he never made a single mistake in a letter. But if the joking became utterly intolerable, as when they jogged his hand and prevented his attending to his work, he would exclaim, "Leave me alone. Why do you insult me?" And there was something strange in the words and the voice in which they were uttered. There was in it a something which moved to pity, so that one man, lately entered, who, taking pattern by the others, had permitted himself to make sport of him, suddenly stopped short, as though all had undergone a transformation before him, and presented itself in a different aspect. Some unseen force repelled him from the comrades whose acquaintances he had made, on the supposition that they were well-bred and polite men. And long afterwards, in his gayest moments, there came to his mind the little official with the bald forehead, with the heart-rending words, "Leave me alone. Why do you insult me?" And in these penetrating words, other words resounded, "I am thy brother." And the poor young man covered his face with his hand, and many a time afterwards in the course of his life he shuddered at seeing how much inhumanity there is in man, how much savage coarseness is concealed in delicate refined worldliness. And, O God, even in that man whom the world acknowledges as honorable and noble. It would be difficult to find another man who lived so entirely for his duties. It is saying but little to say that he served with zeal. No, he served with love. In that copying he saw a varied and agreeable world. Enjoyment was written on his face. Some letters were favorites with him, and when he encountered them, he became unlike himself. He smiled and winked and assisted with his lips, so that it seemed as though each letter might be read in his face, as his pen traced it. If his pay had been in proportion to his zeal, he would, perhaps, to his own surprise, have been made even a councillor of state. But he served, as his companions the wits put it, like a buckle in a buttonhole. Moreover, it is impossible to say that no attention was paid to him. One director, being a kindly man, and desirous of rewarding him for his long service, ordered him to be given something more important than mere copying. Namely, he was ordered to make a report of an already concluded affair to another court. The matter consisted simply in changing the heading and altering a few words from the first to the third person. This caused him so much toil that he was all in a perspiration, rubbed his forehead, and finally said, "No, give me rather something to copy." After that they let him copy on forever. Outside this copying, it appeared that nothing existed for him. He thought not at all of his clothes. His undress uniform was not green, but a sort of rusty meal color. The collar was narrow, low, so that his neck, in spite of the fact that it was not long, seemed inordinately long as it emerged from that collar, like the necks of plaster cats which wag their heads and are carried about upon the heads of scores of Russian foreigners. And something was always sticking to his uniform, either a piece of hay or some trifle. Moreover, he had a peculiar knack, as he walked in the street, of arriving beneath a window when all sorts of rubbish was being flung out of it. Hence he always bore about on his hat melon and watermelon rinds, and other such stuff. Never once in his life did he give heed to what was going on every day in the street. While it is well known that his young brother official, extending the range of his bold glance, gets so that he can see when anyone's trouser straps drop down upon the opposite sidewalk, which always calls forth a malicious smile upon his face. But Akaky Akakiyevich, if he looked at anything, saw in all things the clean, even strokes of his written lines, and only when a horse thrust his muzzle from some unknown quarter over his shoulder and sent a whole gust of wind down his neck from his nostrils, did he observe that he was not in the middle of a line, but in the middle of the street. On arriving at home, he sat down at once at the table, supped his cabbage soup quickly, and ate a bit of beef with onions, never noticing their taste, ate it all with flies and anything else which the Lord sent at the moment. On observing that his stomach began to puff out, he rose from the table, took out a little vial with ink, and copied papers which he had brought home. If there happened to be none, he took copies for himself, for his own gratification, especially if the paper was noteworthy, not on account of its beautiful style, but of its being addressed to some new or distinguished person. Even at the hour when the grey Petersburg sky was quite disappeared, and all the world of tchinovniks had eaten or dined, each as he could, in accordance with the salary he received and his own fancy, when all were resting from the departmental jar of pens, running to and fro, to their own and other people's indispensable occupations, and all the work that an uneasy man makes willing for himself rather than what is necessary, when tchinovniks hasten to dedicate to pleasure the time which is left to them, one bolder than the rest goes to the theatre, another into the streets, devoting it to the inspection of some bonnets. One wastes his evening in compliments to some pretty girl, the star of a small official circle. One, and this is the most common case of all, goes to his comrades on the 4th or 3rd floor, or to 2 small rooms with an anteroom or kitchen, and some pretensions to fashion, a lamp or some other trifle which has cost many a sacrifice of dinner or excursion. In a word, even at the hour when all tchinovniks disperse among the contracted quarters of their friends, to play at whist, as they sip their tea from glasses with a kopek's worth of sugar, draw smoke through long pipes, relating at times some bits of gossip which a Russian man can never, under any circumstances, refrain from, or even when there is nothing to say, recounting everlasting anecdotes about the commandant whom they had sent to inform that the tails of the horses on the Falconet monument had been cut off, in a word, even when all strive to divert themselves, Akaky Akakiyevich yielded to no diversion. No one could ever say that they had seen him at any sort of an evening party. Having written to his heart's content, he lay down to sleep, smiling at the thought of the coming day, of what God might send to copy on the morrow. Thus flowed on the peaceful life of the man, who, with a salary of 400 roubles, understood how to be content with his fate, and thus it would have continued to flow on, perhaps to extreme old age, were there not various ills sown along the path of life for titular councillors, as well as for private, actual, court, and every other species of councillor, even for those who never give any advice, or take any themselves? There exists in Petersburg a powerful foe of all, who receives 400 rubles salary a year or thereabouts. This foe is no other than our northern cold, although it is said to be very wholesome. At 9 o'clock in the morning, at the very hour when the streets are filled with men bound for their departments, it begins to bestow such powerful and piercing nips on all noses impartially, that the poor officials really do not know what to do with them. At the hour when the foreheads of even those who occupy exalted positions ache with the cold, and tears start in their eyes, the poor titular councillors are somewhat unprotected. Their only salvation lies in traversing as quickly as possible, with their little thin cloaks, 5 or 6 streets, and then warming their feet well in the porter's room, and so thawing all their talents and qualifications for official service, which had become frozen on the way. Akaky Akakiyevich had felt for some time that his back and shoulders suffered with peculiar poignancy, in spite of the fact that he had tried to traverse the legal distance with all possible speed. He finally wondered whether the fault did not lie in his cloak. He examined it thoroughly at home and discovered that in 2 places, namely on the back and shoulders, it had become thin as mosquito netting. The cloth was worn to such a degree that he could see through it, and the lining had fallen into pieces. You must know that Akaky Akakiyevich's cloak served as an object of ridicule to the chinovniks. They even deprived it of the noble name of cloak and called it a capote. In fact, it was of singular make. Its collar diminished year by year, but served to patch its other parts. The patching did not exhibit great skill on the part of the tailor, and turned out in fact baggy and ugly. Seeing how the matter stood, Akaky Akakiyevich decided that it would be necessary to take the cloak to Petrovich, the tailor, who lived somewhere on the 4th floor up a dark staircase, and who, in spite of his having but one eye and pockmarks all over his face, busied himself with considerable success in repairing the trousers and coats of officials and others. That is to say, when he was sober and not nursing some other scheme in his head. It is not necessary to say much about this tailor, but as it is the custom to have the character of each personage in a novel clearly defined, there is nothing to be done. So here is Petrovich the tailor. At first he was called only Grigory, and was some gentleman's serf. He began to call himself Petrovich from the time when he received his free papers, and began to drink heavily on the holidays. At first on the great ones, and then on all church festivals without discrimination, wherever a cross stood in the calendar. On this point he was faithful to ancestral custom, and quarrelling with his wife, he called her a low female and a German. As we have stumbled upon his wife, it will be necessary to say a word or two about her, but unfortunately little is known of her beyond the fact that Petrovich has a wife who wears a cap and a dress. But she cannot lay claim to beauty, it seems. At least no one but the soldiers of the guard, as they pulled their moustaches and uttered some peculiar sound, even looked under her cap when they met her. Ascending the staircase which led to Petrovich, which, to do it justice, was all soaked in water, dishwater, and penetrated with the smell of spirits which affects the eyes, and is an inevitable adjunct to all dark stairways in Petersburg houses. Ascending the stairs, Akaky Akakiyevich pondered how much Petrovich would ask, and mentally resolved not to give more than 2 rubles. The door was open, for the mistress, in cooking some fish, had raised such a smoke in the kitchen that not even the beetles were visible. Akaky Akakiyevich passed through the kitchen unperceived, even by the housewife, and at length reached a room where he beheld Petrovich, seated on a large unpainted table, with his legs tucked under him like a Turkish pasha. His feet were bare, after the fashion of tailors as they sit at work, and the first thing which arrested the eye was his thumb, very well known to Akaky Akakiyevich, with a deformed nail, thick and strong as a turtle's shell. On Petrovitch's neck hung a skein of silk and thread, and upon his knees lay some old garment. He had been trying for 3 minutes to thread his needle, unsuccessfully, and so was very angry with the darkness, and even with the thread growling in a low voice, "It won't go through, the barbarian! You'll prick me, you rascal!" Akaky Akakiyevich was displeased at arriving at the precise moment when Petrovitch was angry. He liked to order something of Petrovitch when the latter was a little downhearted, or, as his wife expressed it, "when he had settled himself with brandy, the one-eyed devil." Under such circumstances, Petrovitch generally came down in his price very readily, and came to an understanding, and even bowed and returned thanks. Afterwards, to be sure, his wife came, complaining that her husband was drunk, and so had set the price too low. But if only a 10-kopeck piece were added, then the matter was settled. But now it appeared that Petrovitch was in a sober condition, and therefore rough, taciturn, and inclined to demand Satan only knows what price. Akaky Akakiyevich felt this, and would gladly have beat a retreat, as the saying goes. But he was in for it. Petrovitch screwed up his one eye very intently at him, and Akaky Akakiyevich involuntarily said, "How do you do, Petrovitch?" "I wish you a very good morning, sir," said Petrovitch, and squinted at Akaky Akakiyevich's hands, wishing to see what sort of booty he had brought. To you, Petrovitch, this." It must be known that Akaky Akakiyevich expressed himself chiefly by prepositions, adverbs, and by such scraps of phrases as had no meaning whatever. But if the matter was a very difficult one, then he had a habit of never completing his sentences, so that quite frequently, having begun his phrase with the words, "That is, in fact, quite," there was no more of it, and he forgot himself, thinking that he had already finished it. "What is it?" asked Petrovitch, and with his one eye scanned his whole uniform, beginning with the collar down to the cuffs, the back, the tails, and buttonholes, all of which were very well known to him, because they were his own handiwork. Such is the habit of tailors. It is the first thing they do on meeting one. "But here, this, Petrovitch, a cloth. Here, you see, everywhere, in different places, it is quite strong. It is a little dusty and looks old, but it is new, only here in one place it is a little on the back, and here in one of the shoulders it is a little worn. Yes, here, on this shoulder, it is a little. Do you see? This is it, and a little work." Petrovitch took the mantle, spread it out, to begin with, on the table, looked long at it, shook his head, put out his hand to the window-sill after his snuff-box, adorned with the portrait of some general. Just what general is unknown, for the place where the face belonged had been rubbed through by the finger, and a square bit of paper had been pasted on. Having taken a pinch of snuff, Petrovitch spread the cloak out on his hands, and inspected it against the light, and again shook his head. Then he turned it, lining upwards, and shook his head once more. Again he removed the general-adored cover with its bit of pasted paper, having stuffed his nose with snuff, covered and put away the snuff-box, and said, "No, it is impossible to mend it. It's a miserable garment." Akaky Akakiyevich's heart sank at these words. "Why is it impossible, Petrovitch?" he said, almost in the pleading voice of a child. "All that ails it is that it is worn at the shoulders. You must have some pieces." "Yes, patches could be found. Patches are easily found," said Petrovich. "But there's nothing to sew them to. The thing is completely rotten. If you touch a needle to it, see, it will give way."
"Let it give way. You can put on another patch at once."
"But there is nothing to put the patch on. There's no use in strengthening it. It is very far gone. It's lucky that it's cloth, for if the wind were to blow, it would fly away."
"Well, strengthen it again. How's this, in fact?"
"No," said Petrovich decisively. "There is nothing to be done with it. It's a thoroughly bad job. You'd better, when the cold winter weather comes on, make yourself some foot bandages out of it, because stockings are not warm. The Germans invented them in order to make more money." Petrovich loved, on occasion, to give a fling at the Germans. "But it is plain you must have a new cloak." At the word new, all grew dark before Akaky Akakiyevich's eyes, and everything in the room began to whirl round. The only thing he saw clearly was the general with the paper face on Petrovich's snuff-box cover.
"How, a new one?" he said, as if still in a dream. "Why, I have no money for that."
"Yes, a new one," said Petrovich with barbarous composure.
"Well, if it came to a new one, how it—"
"You mean, how much would it cost?"
"Yes."
"Well, you would have to lay out 150 or more," said Petrovich, and pursed up his lips significantly. He greatly liked powerful effects, liked to stun utterly and suddenly, and then to glance sideways to see what face the stunned person would put on the matter.
150 roubles for a cloak?" shrieked poor Akaky Akakiyevich. Shrieked, perhaps, for the first time in his life, for his voice had always been distinguished for its softness.
"Yes, sir," said Petrovich, "for any sort of a cloak. If you have marten fur on the collar or a silk-lined hood, it will mount up to 200.
"Petrovich, please,"
said Akaky Akakiyevich in a beseeching tone, not hearing and not trying to hear Petrovich's words and all his effects.
"Some repairs, in order that it may wear yet a little longer."
"No, then, it would be a waste of labor and money," said Petrovich, and Akaky Akakiyevich went away after these words, utterly discouraged. But Petrovich stood long after his departure, with significantly compressed lips, and not betaking himself to his work, satisfied that he would not be dropped, and an artistic tailor employed. Akaky Akakiyevich went out into the street, as if in a dream.
"Such an affair," he said to himself. "I did not think it had come to—"
And then, after a pause, he added,
"Well, so it is. See what it has come to at last. And I never imagined it was so."
Then, following a long silence, after which he exclaimed,
"Well, so it is. See what already exactly nothing expected that it would be nothing. What a circumstance!"
So saying, instead of going home, he went in exactly the opposite direction without himself suspecting it. On the way a chimney-sweep brought his dirty side up against him, and blackened his whole shoulder. A whole hatful of rubbish landed on him from the top of a house which was building. He observed it not, and afterwards, when he ran into a sentry, who had planted his halberd beside him, was shaking some stuff from his box into his horny hand. Only then did he recover himself a little, and that because the sentry said, "Why are you thrusting yourself into a man's face? Haven't you the sidewalk?" This caused him to turn about him and turn towards home. There only he finally began to collect his thoughts, and to survey his position in its clear and actual light. and to urge with himself, not brokenly, but sensibly and frankly, as with a reasonable friend, with whom one can discuss very private and personal matters. "No," said Akaky Akakiyevich, "it is impossible to reason with Petrovitch now. He is that. Evidently his wife has been beating him. I'd better go to him Sunday morning. After Saturday night he will be a little cross-eyed and sleepy, for he will have to get drunk, and his wife won't give him any money, and at such a time a 10-kopeck piece in his hand he will become more fit to reason with, and then the cloak and that." Thus argued Akaky Akakiyevich with himself, regained his courage, and waited until the first Sunday when, seeing from afar that Petrovitch's wife had gone out of the house, he went straight to him. Petrovitch's eye was very much askew. In fact, after Saturday, his head drooped, and he was very sleepy. But for all that, as soon as he knew what the question was, it seemed as though Satan jogged his memory. "Impossible," he said. "Please to order a new one." Thereupon Akaky Akakiyevich handed over the 10-kopeck piece. "Thank you, sir. I will drink your good health," said Petrovitch. "But as for the cloak, don't trouble yourself about it. It is good for nothing. I will make you a new cloak famously, and let us settle about it now." Akaky Akakiyevich was still for mending it, but Petrovitch would not hear to it, and said, "I shall certainly make you a new one, and please depend on it, and I shall do my best. It may be, as the fashion goes, that the collar can be fastened by silver hooks under a flap." Then Akaky Akakiyevich saw that it was impossible to get along without a new cloak, and his spirits sank utterly. How, in fact, was it to be accomplished? Where was the money to come from? He might, to be sure, depend in part upon his present at Christmas, but that money had long been doled out and allotted beforehand. He must have some new trousers, and pay a debt of long standing to the shoemaker for putting new tops to his old boots, and he must order 3 shirts from the seamstress, and a couple of pieces of linen which it is impolite to mention in print. In a word, all his money must be spent. And even if the director should be so kind as to order 45 roubles instead of 40 or even 50, it would be mere nothing and a mere drop in the ocean towards the capital necessary for a cloak. Although he knew that Petrovitch was wrong-headed enough to blurt out some outrageous price, Satan knows what, so that his own wife could not refrain from exclaiming, "Have you lost your senses, you fool?" At one time he would not work at any price, and now it was quite likely that he had asked a price which it was not worth. Although he knew that Petrovitch would undertake to make it for 80 roubles, still, where was he to get the 80 roubles? He might possibly manage half. Yes, half of that might be procured, but where was the other half to come from? But the reader must first be told where the first half came from. Akaky Akakiyevich had a habit of putting, for every rouble he spent, a groschen into a small box, fastened with a lock, and with a hole in the top for the reception of money. At the end of each half-year he counted over the heaps of coppers and changed it into small silver coins. This he continued for a long time, and thus, in the course of some years, the sum proved to the amount of over 40 roubles. Thus he had one half on hand. But where to get the other half? Where to get another 40 roubles? Akaky Akakiyevich thought and thought, and decided that it would be necessary to curtail his ordinary expenses, for the space of 1 year at least, to dispense with tea in the evening, to burn no candles, and if there was anything he must do, to go into his landlady's room and work by her light. When he went into the street, he must walk as lightly as possible and as cautiously upon the stones and flagging, almost upon tiptoe, in order not to wear out his heels in too short a time. He must give the laundress as little to wash as possible, and in order not to wear out his clothes, he must take them off as soon as he got home, and wear only his cotton dressing-gown, which had been long and carefully saved. To tell the truth, it was a little hard for him at first to accustom himself to these deprivations, but he got used to them at length after a fashion, and all went smoothly. He even got used to being hungry in the evening, but made up for it by treating himself in spirit, bearing ever in mind the thought of his future cloak. From that time forth his existence seemed to become, in some small way, fuller, as if he were married, as if some other man lived in him, as if he were not alone, and some charming friend had consented to go along life's path with him. The friend was no other than that cloak, with thick wadding and a strong lining incapable of wearing out. He became more lively, and his character even became firmer, like that of a man who had made up his mind and set himself a goal. In his face and gait, doubt and indecision, in short, all hesitating and wavering traits, disappeared of themselves. Fire gleamed in his eyes. Occasionally, the boldest and most daring ideas flitted through his mind. Why not, in fact, have marten fur on the collar? The thought of this nearly made him absent-minded. Once, in copying a letter, he nearly made a mistake, so that he exclaimed almost aloud, "Ugh!" and crossed himself. Once in the course of every month he had a conference with Petrovitch on the subject of the coat, where it would be better to buy the cloth, and the color, and the price, and he always returned home satisfied, though troubled, reflecting that the time would come at last when it would all be bought, and then the cloak would be made. The matter progressed more briskly than he had expected. Far beyond all his hopes, the director appointed neither 40 nor 45 roubles for Akaky Akakeyevitch's share, but 60. Did he suspect that Akaky Akakeyevitch needed a cloak, or did it merely happen so? At all events, 20 extra roubles were by this means provided. This circumstance hastened matters. Only 2 or 3 months more of hunger, and Akaky Akakeyevitch had accumulated about 80 roubles. His heart, generally so quiet, began to beat. On the first possible day he visited the shops in company with Petrovitch. They purchased some very good cloth, and reasonably, for they had been considering the matter for 6 months, and rarely did a month pass without their visiting the shops to inquire prices. And Petrovitch said himself that no better cloth could be had. For lining they selected a cotton stuff, but so firm and thick that Petrovitch declared it to be better than silk, and even prettier and more glossy. They did not buy the marten fur because it was dear in fact, but in its stead they picked out the very best of catskin which could be found in the shop, and which might be taken for marten at a distance. Petrovitch worked at the cloak 2 whole weeks, for there was a great deal of quilting, otherwise it would have been done sooner. Petrovitch charged 12 roubles for his work. It could not possibly be done for less. It was all sewn with silk in small double seams, and Petrovitch went over each seam afterwards with his own teeth, stamping in various patterns. It is difficult to say precisely on what day, but it was probably the most glorious day in Akaky Akakeyevitch's life, when Petrovitch at length brought home the cloak. He brought it in the morning, before the hour it was necessary to go to the department. Never did a cloak arrive so exactly in the nick of time, for the severe cold had set in, and it seemed to threaten increase. Petrovitch presented himself with the coat as benefits a good tailor. On his countenance was a significant expression, such as Akaky Akakiyevich had never beheld there. He seemed sensible to the fullest extent that he had done no small deed, and that a gulf had suddenly appeared, separating tailors who only put in linings and make repairs from those who made new things. He took the cloak out of the pocket-handkerchief in which he had brought it. The handkerchief was fresh from the laundress. He now removed it and put it in his pocket for use. Taking out the cloak, he gazed proudly at it, held it with both hands, and flung it very skilfully over the shoulders of Akaky Akakiyevich. Then he pulled it and fitted it down behind with his hand. Then he draped it around Akaky Akakiyevich without buttoning it. Akaky Akakiyevich, as a man advanced in life, wished to try the sleeves. Petrovich helped him on with them, and it turned out that the sleeves were satisfactory also. In short, the cloak appeared to be perfect, and just in season. Petrovich did not neglect this opportunity to observe that it was only because he lived in a narrow street and had no signboard, and because he had known Akaky Akakiyevich so long, that he had made it so cheaply. But if he had been on the Nevsky Prospect, he would have charged 75 roubles for the making alone. Akaky Akakiyevich did not care to argue this point with Petrovich, and he was afraid of the large sums with which Petrovich was fond of raising the dust. He paid him, thanked him, and set out at once in his new cloak for the department. Petrovich followed him, and, pausing in the street, gazed long at the cloak in the distance, and went to one side expressly to run around the crooked alley and emerge again into the street to gaze once more upon the cloak from another point, namely, directly in front. Meanwhile, Akaky Akakiyevich went on with every sense in holiday mood. He was conscious every second of the time, and he had a new cloak on his shoulders, and several times he laughed with internal satisfaction. In fact, there were two advantages. One was its warmth, the other its beauty. He saw nothing of the road, and suddenly found himself at the department. He threw off his cloak in the anteroom, looked it well over, and confided it to the especial care of the janitor. It was impossible to say just how everyone in the department knew at once that Akaky Akakiyevich had a new cloak, and that the mantle no longer existed. All rushed at the same moment into the anteroom to inspect Akaky Akakiyevich's new cloak. They began to congratulate him and to say pleasant things to him, so that he began at first to smile, and then he grew ashamed. When all surrounded him and began to say that the new cloak must be christened, and that he must give a whole evening at least to it, Akaky Akakiyevich lost his head completely, knew not where he stood, what to answer, and how to get out of it. He stood blushing all over for several minutes, and was on the point of assuring them with great simplicity that it was not a new cloak, that it was so and so, that it was the old cloak. At length one of the chinovniks, some assistant chief probably, in order to show that he was not at all proud, and on good terms with his inferiors, said, "So be it. I will give the party instead of Akaky Akakiyevich. I invite you all to tea with me tonight. It happens quite apropos. It is my name-day." The officials naturally at once offered the assistant chief their congratulations, and accepted the invitation with pleasure. Akaky Akakiyevich would have declined, but all declared that it was discourteous, that it was simply a sin and a shame, and that he could not possibly refuse. Besides, the idea became pleasant to him when he recollected that he should thereby have a chance to wear his new cloak in the evening also. That whole day was truly a most triumphant festival day for Akaky Akakiyevich. He returned home in the most happy frame of mind, threw off his cloak, and hung it carefully on the wall, admiring afresh the cloth and the lining. And then he brought out his old worn-out cloak for comparison. He looked at it and laughed. So vast was the difference, and long after dinner he laughed again when the condition of the mantle reoccurred to his mind. He dined gaily, but took his ease for a while on the bed, until it got dark. Then he dressed himself leisurely, put on his cloak, and stepped out into the street. End of The Cloak, Part 1 of 2.